The desert wind howled across the New Mexico plateau on that scorching July afternoon in 1945, carrying with it the weight of a secret that could change the world forever. Deep in the restricted zone near Los Alamos, where armed guards patrolled fences that seemed to stretch into infinity, the greatest scientific minds humanity had ever assembled were about to make a decision that would determine whether the war would end with a bang or whether an entire region would become an uninhabitable wasteland for generations to come. But none of them, not the physicists with their advanced degrees, not the military generals with their decades of experience, not the government officials with their security clearances, could have predicted that the answer to their most critical question would come from the most unlikely source imaginable: a simple farmer who had never finished elementary school. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories from history that you won't believe actually happened. Robert Hendricks had lived his entire 53 years within 20 miles of where he was born, working the same patch of stubborn New Mexico soil his father had worked before him. His hands were calloused from decades of labor, his face weathered like the desert rocks that dotted his property, and his formal education had ended at age 12, when his father needed help keeping the farm running during the hard years. The war had touched his life like it had touched everyone's. His 2 sons were somewhere in the Pacific fighting an enemy he could barely imagine, and his daughter worked in a factory in Albuquerque, building parts for machines she wasn't allowed to know the purpose of. But until that summer, the strange government facility that had sprouted up in the mountains like a military mushroom had been nothing more than a curiosity, something the locals whispered about in the general store but knew better than to ask questions about. The Los Alamos laboratory was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Thousands of people lived and worked behind those fences, brilliant scientists who had been plucked from universities across America and beyond, brought together for a purpose so secret that even they didn't know the full picture at first. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the brilliant physicist who led the project, had assembled a team that read like a who's who of scientific genius: Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman, Enrico Fermi, and dozens more whose names would later become synonymous with the atomic age. They worked in hastily constructed buildings, calculated equations on chalkboards that were erased every night, and lived with the constant awareness that they were racing against time itself. In Germany, they knew Hitler's scientists were working on the same problem, and whoever solved it first would hold the power to end the war on their terms. The summer heat of 1945 was particularly brutal. The sun beat down on the desert with relentless intensity, turning the air into a shimmering haze that made the distant mountains dance on the horizon. Inside the laboratory, the air was thick with tension that had nothing to do with the temperature. The device was nearly ready. Years of theoretical work, countless calculations, millions of dollars, and the combined genius of the greatest minds in physics had brought them to this moment. But there was a problem, and it was the kind of problem that kept Oppenheimer awake at night, pacing the floors of his quarters, chain-smoking cigarettes until the ashtrays overflowed. The question was simple in its asking but terrifying in its implications. What would happen when they detonated the device? They had theories, of course. They had run calculations until the numbers blurred together. They had debated and argued and theorized until their voices were hoarse. But the truth was that nobody really knew. This had never been done before. They were about to unleash a force that had previously existed only in the hearts of stars, and they were going to do it here, on Earth, in the New Mexico desert. Edward Teller, the Hungarian physicist whose intensity matched his intellect, had raised a concern that sent chills down the spines of everyone who heard it. He had calculated, or thought he had calculated, that the extreme temperatures generated by the explosion might be hot enough to ignite the nitrogen in Earth's atmosphere. If that happened, the reaction would spread, consuming the atmosphere in a chain reaction that would engulf the entire planet in flames. It would be, quite literally, the end of the world. Not just the end of the war, not just the end of millions of lives, but the end of all life on Earth. The scientists attacked the problem with every tool at their disposal. They ran the numbers again and again, checking and rechecking their calculations. They debated the physics in meetings that stretched late into the night, arguing over assumptions and variables. Hans Bethe, one of the most respected physicists on the team, worked tirelessly to prove that the atmospheric ignition was impossible, that the temperatures, while unprecedented, wouldn't be quite high enough to trigger such a reaction. But there was still uncertainty, still that nagging doubt that whispered in the back of their minds. What if we're wrong? General Leslie Groves, the military man in charge of the entire Manhattan Project, approached the problem with a soldier's pragmatism. The war was costing thousands of lives every day. American boys were dying on islands with names most people couldn't pronounce, fighting an enemy that seemed willing to sacrifice everything rather than surrender. If this device worked, if it could end the war, then wasn't some risk acceptable? But even Groves, hardened by years of military service, felt the weight of this particular decision. Ending the war was one thing. Ending the world was quite another. The debate raged through the spring and into the summer. Some scientists argued for more time, more calculations, more certainty. Others pointed out that certainty might be impossible, that they were dealing with forces and conditions that had never existed on Earth before. How could anyone be certain about something that had never been done? And all the while, the war continued. Every day of delay meant more lives lost, more cities bombed, more suffering prolonged. Robert Hendricks knew nothing of these debates. His days were consumed with the practical concerns of keeping a farm running during wartime with limited help and even more limited supplies. His wife, Martha, managed the household with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown for 30 years of marriage, making do with ration coupons and victory gardens, writing letters to their sons that she tried to keep cheerful despite her constant worry. Their youngest, Tom, was still at home, too young for the draft, but old enough to handle much of the farm work that Robert's aging body found increasingly difficult. The government had been buying eggs from the Hendricks farm for months, a contract that Robert had been grateful for, even though the prices weren't particularly generous. The military installation up in the mountains needed food, and local farms like his were the logical source. Every week a truck would arrive, soldiers would load up crates of eggs, and Robert would receive payment that helped keep the farm afloat. It was a good arrangement, or it had been until that week in July when the truck didn't arrive on schedule. Robert had several hundred eggs sitting in his cool cellar, eggs that wouldn't stay fresh forever in the New Mexico heat, despite his best efforts to keep them cool. After waiting 3 days past the usual pickup time, he made a decision that would change history, though he had no way of knowing it at the time. He loaded the eggs into his old pickup truck, the one he'd been nursing along for years because new vehicles were impossible to get during the war, and he headed up toward Los Alamos to find out what had happened to his regular delivery schedule. The road to Los Alamos had changed dramatically over the past few years. What had once been barely more than a dirt track was now a maintained road, though still rough enough to make Robert's truck rattle and shake over every bump. As he climbed higher into the mountains, the desert landscape gradually gave way to pinyon pines and juniper trees, offering blessed shade from the relentless sun. He'd driven this route a few times before for deliveries, but he'd never quite gotten used to the sight of the checkpoint that now blocked the road about 5 miles from the laboratory itself. 2 young soldiers, neither of them looking old enough to shave regularly, stepped out of the guardhouse as Robert's truck approached. They were polite but firm, their hands resting casually but noticeably near their weapons. Robert explained his situation. He had eggs to deliver, the regular truck hadn't shown up, and he needed to know what was going on with his contract. The soldiers exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about what to do with this unexpected visitor. This wasn't the kind of situation covered in their standard procedures. After some discussion on their field telephone, connecting with someone farther up the chain of command, Robert was told to wait. He sat in his truck, watching the shadows lengthen as the afternoon wore on, wondering if he'd made a mistake coming up here. But he needed that income, and those eggs weren't going to last forever. After about 40 minutes, a jeep came down the road from the direction of the laboratory, carrying an officer who introduced himself as Lieutenant Morrison. Morrison was a young man, probably not much older than Robert's sons, with the intense, slightly frazzled look of someone who hadn't been sleeping well lately. He explained that there had been a change in schedule due to an important test that was being prepared, that regular deliveries had been temporarily suspended, but that they would certainly take Robert's eggs and make sure he was paid. But then, perhaps because the stress of the past weeks had worn down his usual discretion, or perhaps because Robert's weathered, honest face reminded him of his own father back in Iowa, Morrison made a comment he probably shouldn't have made. "We've got a big test coming up," Morrison said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Biggest thing you can imagine. Everyone's on edge about it. There's even some worry about whether it might be too big, if you know what I mean." Robert didn't know what he meant, but something in the lieutenant's voice caught his attention. It was the kind of worry that went beyond ordinary military concerns. Robert had heard that tone before, in the voices of neighbors discussing whether their sons would come home from the war, in the voice of the doctor who had told him his father was dying. It was the sound of a man contemplating something truly frightening. "Too big how?" Robert asked, his farmer's practicality cutting through to the heart of the matter. Morrison hesitated, clearly realizing he'd already said more than he should. But there was something about this moment, standing in the shade of the guardhouse, with the desert stretching out below them, and the weight of the world's greatest secret pressing down on him, that made him continue. "Some of the scientists think the test might start a reaction that could spread. Like lighting a match in a gas station, but bigger. A lot bigger." Morrison's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Maybe spread across the whole area. Maybe farther." Robert was quiet for a moment, processing this information. He didn't understand the science, didn't need to. He understood the basic concept. The military was planning to test something that might accidentally cause a disaster. He thought about his farm, about Martha waiting at home, about his sons fighting somewhere in the Pacific, about all the people who lived and worked in this part of New Mexico. Then he asked a question that seemed so simple, so obvious, that Morrison actually laughed when he heard it. But it was the kind of laugh that comes when someone points out something you should have seen all along, but somehow missed. "Well," Robert said slowly, "if you're worried it might spread and cause problems, why don't you test it somewhere it can't spread? Somewhere with nothing around it that could catch?" Morrison stared at him. It was such a simple question, asked in such a straightforward manner that it seemed almost stupid. But as the words sank in, Morrison realized it wasn't stupid at all. It was perhaps the most important question anyone had asked in months. The scientists had been so focused on whether atmospheric ignition was possible, on the theoretical physics and the complex calculations, that they'd approached it as a yes or no question. Either it would happen or it wouldn't. They'd been trying to prove it was safe, trying to build enough certainty to proceed. But this farmer, this man who probably couldn't solve a quadratic equation if his life depended on it, had approached it from a completely different angle. If you're not sure it's safe, why not plan as if it isn't? Morrison drove back to the laboratory faster than regulations probably allowed, his mind racing. He went straight to his superior, who listened with growing interest to the story of the farmer and his question. Within hours, Robert's simple query had made its way up the chain of command, reaching the ears of the scientists and military planners who were struggling with the same problem. The reaction was mixed. Some of the physicists were initially offended that their careful theoretical work was being questioned by someone with no scientific training. But others, including Oppenheimer himself, saw the wisdom in the question. It wasn't about whether the calculations were right or wrong. It was about acknowledging uncertainty and planning accordingly. A meeting was called, one of the most important of the entire Manhattan Project. In a room thick with cigarette smoke and tension, the greatest scientific minds of the generation reconsidered their approach to the test. They had already selected a site called Trinity in the Jornada del Muerto Desert, about 200 miles south of Los Alamos. It was remote, relatively flat, and offered good visibility for observing the test. But they had chosen it thinking primarily about the logistics of conducting the test and observing the results, not about what might happen if their worst fears came true. Now they looked at it differently. They examined maps of the region, calculating what would happen if the reaction did spread. They identified additional safety protocols, planned evacuation routes for the surrounding area, and established a wider perimeter. More importantly, they revised their safety calculations with a new assumption. What if we're wrong about this being safe? What then? Hans Bethe and his team redoubled their efforts to prove the atmospheric ignition was impossible, but now they did so with explicit safety margins built into their calculations. They didn't just try to prove it wouldn't happen. They tried to prove that even in their worst-case scenarios, with every variable pushed to its theoretical extreme, it still wouldn't happen. The standard of proof became higher, more rigorous, more demanding. Enrico Fermi, the Italian physicist whose work had been fundamental to the entire project, proposed a different approach to thinking about the risk. Instead of trying to achieve absolute certainty, which might be impossible, they should quantify the uncertainty and make an informed decision based on that. He calculated odds, assigned probabilities, and presented the military commanders with a clear assessment. The risk existed, but it was vanishingly small, and here's exactly how small. General Groves listened to all of this with a soldier's practicality. He understood risk. Every military operation involved risk. The question was whether the risk was acceptable given the potential reward. But he also understood something the scientists sometimes forgot. Risk isn't just about probability, it's about consequences. Even a small probability of ending the world was worth taking seriously. New safety measures were implemented with a thoroughness that would have seemed excessive just weeks earlier. Additional monitoring equipment was installed at the Trinity site, sophisticated instruments that would measure everything from radiation levels to atmospheric pressure, from seismic activity to electromagnetic disturbances. Scientists positioned cameras at multiple angles, some as far as 10 miles away, using specially designed lenses that could capture the explosion without being destroyed by the intense light. They buried cables underground to protect them from the blast, running them to observation bunkers constructed from reinforced concrete. Evacuation plans were drawn up for towns and ranches within a much wider radius than originally planned. Military police were assigned to each location, given detailed maps and instructions on exactly how to move civilians to safety if the need arose. They practiced these evacuations, timing how long it would take to move people from the most remote ranches to designated safe zones. Local law enforcement was briefed, though they were told only that there would be a test of a new explosive device and that certain precautions were necessary. Medical personnel were brought in from military hospitals across the Southwest, assembled at staging points without being told exactly what they were preparing for. They were given crash courses in treating burn victims and radiation exposure, though the word radiation was carefully avoided in most of these briefings. Ambulances were positioned at strategic locations. Blood supplies were stockpiled. Emergency communication systems were established, with backup systems for the backup systems, because nobody wanted to contemplate what would happen if the worst occurred and they couldn't coordinate a response. The meteorology team became critically important in ways they hadn't anticipated. They monitored weather patterns obsessively, looking for the perfect conditions: clear skies for observation, wind patterns that would carry any fallout away from populated areas, stable atmospheric conditions that would allow for accurate measurements. They rejected date after date as unsuitable, much to the frustration of General Groves, who watched the calendar pages turn while the war continued and costs mounted. The test was delayed by several weeks while these preparations were completed, a delay that cost millions of dollars and precious time in the race to end the war. But a delay that everyone now agreed was necessary. Each day of delay meant more materials to transport, more security to maintain, more chances for something to go wrong or for the secret to leak. But it also meant more confidence that if something did go catastrophically wrong, they would be as prepared as humanly possible. Robert Hendricks knew none of this. He'd delivered his eggs, received his payment, and gone back to his farm. The soldiers had been polite, even friendly, and he'd returned home satisfied that his contract would continue once their big test was completed, whatever that test was. He told Martha about the trip over dinner that night, mentioning the young lieutenant who'd seemed so worried about something, but he didn't dwell on it. He had work to do, crops to tend, and a farm to run. The weeks passed, and summer deepened into its most intense heat. On July 16, 1945, at 5:29 in the morning, the world changed. The Trinity test succeeded beyond even the most optimistic predictions. A flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns lit up the desert sky. A mushroom cloud rose into the stratosphere. The ground shook with the force of thousands of tons of conventional explosives, but concentrated into a single, terrible instant, and the atmosphere did not ignite. The chain reaction they had feared, the apocalyptic scenario that had haunted their calculations, did not occur. Robert Hendricks saw the flash from his bedroom window. He was up early, as farmers always are, preparing for another day's work. The light was bright enough to wake Martha, who sat up in bed with a startled cry. They both went to the window and saw the glow on the southern horizon, fading now but still visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Thunder rolled across the desert minutes later, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself. "What in God's name was that?" Martha whispered. Robert shook his head slowly. He thought about the young lieutenant, about the worry in his voice, about the test he'd mentioned. "Something big," he said quietly. "Something very big." News of the test was classified, of course. The official story was that an ammunition dump had exploded at a military facility. Most people accepted this explanation, though the ranchers and farmers who knew the desert well exchanged skeptical glances. An ammunition dump didn't make light like that, didn't shake the ground for hundreds of miles around. But it was wartime, and people had learned not to ask too many questions about military matters. 3 weeks later, on August 6th, the world learned what had happened in the New Mexico desert. A single bomb, dropped on Hiroshima, had destroyed an entire city. The newspapers carried the story in enormous headlines. The radio broadcasted special reports. President Truman announced that America had harnessed the power of the atom, that a new era in human history had begun. 3 days after that, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. The war was over. Robert and Martha listened to the news on their radio, sitting in their living room as the announcer's voice crackled through the speaker, describing scenes of celebration in cities across America. Martha cried, not just from relief that the war was ending, but from the hope that their sons would now come home safely. Robert sat quietly, thinking about connections he couldn't quite articulate. about that flash of light on the southern horizon, about the young lieutenant's worried voice. The egg deliveries resumed in September. The regular truck came by each week, and Robert never mentioned his trip to Los Alamos. The soldiers who picked up the eggs were different now, new faces on routine duty, and they treated him with the professional courtesy of men conducting a simple business transaction. There was no reason to think anyone at the laboratory remembered the farmer who'd asked a simple question. But Robert's question had changed things in ways he would never fully understand. The scientists at Los Alamos had been brilliant, their calculations sophisticated, their understanding of physics profound. But they had approached the problem of atmospheric ignition as a theoretical question to be solved through mathematics and debate. Robert, with his farmer's practicality, had asked a different kind of question. If you're not sure, what should you do? It was a question rooted not in theoretical physics, but in common sense, in the kind of practical wisdom that comes from a lifetime of managing risk and uncertainty. His question hadn't changed the science. The calculations that proved atmospheric ignition was impossible were correct, and they would have reached the same conclusion eventually. But his question had changed the approach. It had forced the scientists and military planners to stop thinking about proof and start thinking about precaution, to stop debating whether they were right and start planning for what to do if they were wrong. In doing so, it had led to safety measures and protocols that, while they turned out not to be needed for the atmospheric ignition scenario, were absolutely critical for other aspects of the test. The expanded evacuation plans meant that when the blast proved stronger than expected, when radioactive fallout drifted farther than the original calculations had predicted, there were fewer people in harm's way. The additional monitoring equipment provided data that would prove invaluable for future nuclear research and safety protocols. The higher standard of proof that Beth and his team had worked to achieve became the foundation for nuclear safety standards that would guide atomic research for decades to come. In the years after the war, Robert's life returned to its familiar rhythms. His sons came home, both of them changed by what they'd experienced, but alive and whole. The eldest, James, had been at Iwo Jima, and he didn't talk much about what he'd seen there. He came back quieter than he'd left, more serious, but he threw himself into farm work with an intensity that suggested he was grateful for something solid and real to focus on. The younger son, William, had served on a destroyer in the Pacific and had stories about storms and near misses that he would tell at family gatherings, though Robert noticed that the stories were always about the weather and the ship, never about combat or death. His daughter married and settled in Albuquerque, visiting the farm on holidays with her growing family. She'd met her husband at the factory where she'd worked during the war, and they'd built a good life together in the city. Her children, Robert's grandchildren, would run through the same fields where their mother had played, and Robert would watch them with a satisfaction that came from knowing that the work of his hands had created something lasting, something that would continue after he was gone. The military installation in the mountains continued its work, though Robert never knew exactly what they did up there, and eventually he stopped wondering. The laboratory became a permanent part of the landscape, and Los Alamos transformed from a secret wartime facility into a town, albeit one with more security checkpoints than most. Scientists settled there with their families, sending their children to schools and shopping at stores, living ordinary lives built around extraordinary work. The egg contracts continued for several years, a reliable source of income that helped Robert modernize some aspects of his operation. He bought better equipment when it became available after the war, installed electric lighting in his barns, even got a new truck to replace the aging vehicle that had carried those eggs up to the checkpoint that day. He hired help when he needed it, paid fair wages, and built a reputation as a good employer. The farm prospered in the post-war years, benefiting from improved roads and better access to markets. He worked his farm until his body told him it was time to slow down, passing on more and more responsibility to James, who had decided to stay and continue the family tradition. And then he worked it some more, because that's what farmers do. You don't retire from the land, you just gradually hand it over to the next generation while continuing to offer advice and help with the heavy work for as long as your body allows. Robert was still checking on his chickens and walking his fields when he was well into his 60s, still getting up before dawn, because that's when farmers get up, still finding satisfaction in work well done and crops properly tended. Martha aged alongside him, her hair turning grey and then white, her hands developing the same arthritic ache that troubled his own fingers on cold mornings. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1965, surrounded by children and grandchildren and neighbours who'd known them for decades. It was a simple celebration, held at the church where they'd been married, followed by a potluck dinner where people shared stories and laughter. Robert gave a short speech, thanking Martha for 50 years of partnership and support, his voice cracking slightly with emotion as he spoke. It was, he said, the best decision he'd ever made, marrying her, and he'd lived a good life because of it. He died in 1968, on a cold January morning, with Martha holding his hand and his children gathered around his bed. The obituary in the local paper noted that he'd been a lifelong resident of the area, a veteran of the First World War, a farmer who'd worked the same land for over 50 years. It mentioned his children and grandchildren, his membership in the local Methodist church, his reputation as an honest dealer and a good neighbor. It said nothing about eggs delivered to Los Alamos, nothing about a simple question asked at a checkpoint, nothing about his small role in one of the most important moments in human history. The scientists who heard his question went on to distinguished careers. Some won Nobel Prizes. Some became famous for their work on the atomic bomb and the moral questions it raised. Some spent the rest of their lives working for nuclear disarmament, haunted by what they had created. Oppenheimer himself became a symbol of the atomic age, celebrated and controversial in equal measure, forever associated with the words he spoke after witnessing the Trinity test, quoting from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But none of them, in their memoirs and interviews and historical accounts, ever mentioned the farmer whose question had helped them think more clearly about the risks they were taking. Why would they? From their perspective, the safety protocols and revised calculations were the result of their own scientific rigor, their own careful analysis. They didn't remember the moment when a lieutenant, stressed and overworked, had mentioned their concerns to a farmer at a checkpoint. They didn't know that the farmer's simple question had rippled up through the chain of command, changing the way people thought about the problem. This is often how history works. The famous names, the official accounts, the stories we tell ourselves about great moments and great decisions, these things focus on the people in positions of power and authority, the ones making the formal decisions and taking the official actions. We remember Oppenheimer and Einstein, Groves and Truman, the men whose names appear in the history books and on the memorials. And we should remember them. Their contributions were real and important. But history is also made by countless small moments, by questions asked and connections made, by ordinary people doing ordinary things that happen to intersect with extraordinary events. A farmer worrying about his egg contract. A lieutenant stressed enough to say more than he should. A simple question that reframed a complex problem. These moments don't make it into the official histories, but they matter nonetheless. The Los Alamos laboratory continued its work long after the war ended, becoming a permanent fixture in the New Mexico landscape, a center for nuclear research that exists to this day. The scientists who worked there in those early years became legends, their story told and retold until it took on an almost mythical quality. The brilliant minds who raced against time to build the bomb that ended the war. It's a powerful story, and much of it is true. But the complete story, like all complete stories, is more complicated and more interesting than the myth. It includes moments of doubt and fear, mistakes and corrections, lucky breaks and near disasters. It includes a farmer who asked a simple question and unknowingly contributed to one of the most important safety decisions in the history of nuclear weapons. It includes the recognition that sometimes the most sophisticated minds can benefit from the most basic wisdom. If you're not sure it's safe, plan as if it isn't. The question of atmospheric ignition in the end was a question about the unknown. The scientists were pushing into territory where no human had ventured before, unleashing forces that had previously existed only in the hearts of stars. They were operating at the very edge of human knowledge, and at that edge, certainty becomes difficult and doubt becomes reasonable. Robert Hendricks understood something that brilliant minds sometimes forget. When you're doing something for the first time, when you're entering unknown territory, caution is not weakness, it's wisdom. Today, when nuclear safety experts talk about protocols and procedures, when they discuss how to manage the risks inherent in working with such powerful forces, they're building on foundations laid during those intense months in 1945. They're building on the work of the brilliant scientists who solved the theoretical problems, but also on the simple insight of a farmer who asked the right question at the right time. Most of them don't know his name, don't know his story, but his influence persists nonetheless, woven into the careful, cautious approach that has, so far, prevented the worst-case scenarios from becoming reality. The desert wind still blows across the New Mexico plateau, carrying dust and memories across a landscape that holds more secrets than most people realize. The Trinity site, where the first atomic bomb was detonated, is now a national historic landmark, open to visitors twice a year. The ground is still slightly radioactive, enough to register on a Geiger counter, but not enough to pose immediate danger. A simple stone obelisk marks the exact spot where the device was detonated, where the world changed in a fraction of a second. Visitors who make the journey to Trinity, who stand in that desert and try to imagine what happened there on that July morning, are usually thinking about the big names and the big moments. They're thinking about Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project, about the end of the war and the beginning of the atomic age. And they should think about those things. They're important. But maybe, occasionally, they should also think about the smaller moments and the quieter voices. About a farmer delivering eggs, a lieutenant saying more than he should, a simple question that changed how people thought about risk. About the fact that sometimes the most important contributions come from the most unexpected sources. About the reality that brilliance alone isn't always enough. That sometimes you also need someone to ask the obvious question that everyone else has overlooked. Robert Hendricks never knew that his question had mattered. He went to his grave thinking of himself as a simple farmer who'd lived an ordinary life, who'd done his best to take care of his family and his land, who'd witnessed the great events of the 20th century from a distance, never suspecting that he'd played a small but significant role in one of the greatest. Perhaps that's fitting. The people who change history aren't always the ones who know they're doing it. Sometimes they're just ordinary people asking ordinary questions, and the world shifts in response without them ever realizing what they've done. The story of Los Alamos is usually told as a story about genius and determination, about brilliant minds solving impossible problems under tremendous pressure. And it is that story. But it's also a story about the limitations of brilliance, about the moments when expertise can become tunnel vision, when deep knowledge of complex systems can make you overlook simple truths. It's a story about how a farmer with an 8th-grade education could see something that the smartest physicists in the world had missed, that when you're not certain about something, especially something that could have catastrophic consequences, you should plan for the worst and hope for the best. In the end, the atmospheric ignition didn't happen. The calculations were correct, the science was sound, and the bomb did exactly what the scientists had predicted it would do without triggering any apocalyptic chain reactions. The world did not end on July 16th, 1945. But the fact that it didn't end was, in part, because people took the risk seriously enough to prepare for it. And the fact that they took it that seriously, that they implemented those additional safety measures and protocols, that they raised their standard of proof and expanded their safety margins, was influenced, however indirectly, by a farmer who asked a simple question. Robert Hendricks was buried in the small cemetery outside town, next to his father and mother, in soil that his family had worked for generations. The headstone is simple, just his name and dates, the same as thousands of other ordinary Americans who lived and died in the 20th century. There's nothing to indicate that he had any connection to the atomic bomb, to Los Alamos, to the great secret project that changed the world. And maybe that's appropriate. He didn't think of himself as someone who'd contributed to history. He was just a farmer trying to deliver his eggs and make a living. But history isn't just made by the people who think they're making it. It's made by all of us, in ways large and small, through actions and words and questions we might never realize are important. The Los Alamos scientists were brilliant, dedicated, and deserving of recognition for their incredible achievements. But they were also human, prone to blind spots and assumptions like everyone else. And sometimes it takes an outsider, someone with fresh eyes and a different perspective, to point out what should have been obvious all along. So the next time you hear the story of the Manhattan Project, the next time someone talks about Oppenheimer and the brilliant minds who built the bomb, remember that there were other voices too, quieter voices that don't make it into the official histories, but that mattered nonetheless. Remember that sometimes the most important question isn't the most sophisticated one, and sometimes the most valuable insight comes from the person who knows the least about the technical details, but the most about common sense. Remember a farmer named Robert Hendricks, who delivered eggs and asked a simple question, and who never knew that his simple question helped ensure that the Los Alamos test didn't turn 50 miles of New Mexico into a radioactive crater. Remember that history is made not just by the famous, but by the forgotten. Not just by the experts, but by the ordinary people who happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right question. And remember that sometimes the stupid question, the obvious question, the question that seems too simple to be worth asking, is exactly the question that needs to be asked. The wind still blows across the New Mexico desert, across Trinity and Los Alamos, across the farm that Robert Hendricks worked for 50 years. It carries stories with it, some famous and some forgotten, some recorded in history books, and some lost to time. But they're all part of the same story, the story of how humanity stumbled into the atomic age, brilliant and terrified and uncertain, making decisions that would shape the world for generations to come. And among all those stories, tucked away in the forgotten corners of history, is the story of a farmer and his eggs, and his simple question that helped make sure we survived to tell the tale.